The dog risked its life fighting wolves to protect an old man's farm, and what followed was unbelievable. The Montana winter had always been harsh, but for 73-year-old Frank Mitchell, this year felt different. Standing on his weathered porch in the pre-dawn light, he watched his Great Pyrenees, Bear, patrol the perimeter of the sheep pasture. The massive white dog moved with purpose, his thick coat blending with the patches of early December snow. "Come on, old friend," Frank called, his breath visible in the cold air. "Breakfast time." Bear gave one final scan of the fence line before trotting back to the farmhouse. At 8 years old, he was in his prime for his breed, and every bit of his 120 pounds was muscle and protective instinct. Frank had gotten him as a pup after his wife Martha passed, when the silence of the 200-acre farm became too much to bear. Inside the warm kitchen, Frank's arthritis-stiffened fingers worked to pour kibble into Bear's bowl. The dog waited patiently, his intelligent brown eyes following his master's movements. Only after Frank nodded did Bear begin to eat. "Mr. Mitchell?" A voice called from outside, followed by a knock. "It's David from the Anderson place." Frank opened the door to find his nearest neighbor, bundled against the cold. David Anderson, a third-generation rancher in his 40s, removed his hat as he stepped inside. "Morning, David. Coffee? Please." David settled at the kitchen table, nodding to Bear, who had finished his breakfast and taken up his usual post by the window. "We lost 2 calves last night. Found tracks this morning, wolves." Frank's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "How close?" "Less than 3 miles from your east pasture. Biggest tracks I've seen in years." David accepted the steaming mug. "Game warden says there's a new pack moved down from Canada. Bigger than our usual wolves and bolder too." Frank glanced at his flock of sheep, visible through the window. 57 head, the last remaining piece of what had once been a much larger operation. He'd sold off most of the livestock after Martha died, keeping just enough to give himself purpose. "Been hearing them at night," Frank admitted. "Bear's been restless too. More patrols, less sleep." As if understanding, Bear stood and moved to Frank's side, his massive head reaching table height. David watched the pair, concern evident on his face. "Look, Frank, maybe it's time to consider selling the sheep. Between the wolves and these winters getting worse. This farm's been in my family for 4 generations. Frank cut him off gently. "Martha and I raised our kids here. Now they're all scattered Seattle, Chicago, Boston, living their lives. This land, these sheep, Bear, they're what I have left." David nodded, understanding the pride and stubborn independence that ran deep in Montana ranching families. "At least let me help you reinforce the fences. And I've got some extra solar lights we can put up." As they discussed security measures, Bear suddenly stiffened, his attention locked on something outside. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Frank and David moved to the window. In the growing light, they could see dark shapes moving at the edge of the tree line, at least 3 wolves, larger than any Frank had seen in his 7 decades on the land. Bear's growl deepened, but he held his position, waiting for Frank's command. "They're testing boundaries," David said quietly, "watching, learning patterns." Frank rested his hand on Bear's head, feeling the tension in the dog's muscles. He thought about David's suggestion to sell, about his children's repeated requests for him to move closer to them in the city. But as he watched Bear stand guard, unwavering in his protection, he knew he couldn't leave. "We'll manage," Frank said finally. "We always have." But as David left and the morning wore on, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing in their quiet corner of Montana. The wolves at the tree line were just the beginning, and the true test of loyalty and courage was yet to come. Bear remained vigilant by the window, his white coat painted gold by the rising sun, unaware that in the coming days, he would prove himself a hero in ways none of them could imagine. As December deepened, the signs of trouble multiplied like frost crystals on a window pane. Frank noticed Bear sleeping less, the dog's protective instincts on high alert even during daylight hours. The wolves had grown bolder, their tracks appearing closer to the barn each morning. One particularly cold afternoon, Frank was checking the reinforced fencing David had helped install when he heard Bear's warning bark from the sheep pasture. The sound was different from his usual alerts, deeper, more urgent. "What is it, boy?" Frank called, his boots crunching through fresh snow as he hurried toward the dog. Bear stood rigid, positioning himself between the flock and something in the distance. Through the swirling snow, Frank spotted movement, a large gray wolf, unusually close for this time of day. The animal was massive, its shoulder height rivaling Bear's, with winter-thick fur and eyes that seemed to glow amber in the fading light. "Dear Lord," Frank whispered, reaching for the rifle he'd taken to carrying. But before he could raise it, the wolf melted back into the tree line. That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his logbook, where he'd started documenting the wolf sightings. The numbers were troubling. In just 2 weeks, he'd logged 12 separate encounters, each one closer than the last. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. "Dad," his daughter Sarah's voice carried from Seattle. "How are you holding up?" "Fine. One. Just fine." Frank watched Bear pace by the windows, the dog's reflection ghost-like in the darkness beyond. "David Anderson called me," Sarah said, concern evident in her voice. "He's worried about you, Dad. These wolves, they're not like the ones you used to deal with." Sarah dash, "Please just listen. Tommy and I have that spare room already. You could bring Bear. Get away from all this before dash." "Before what?" Frank's voice was gentle but firm. "Before I can't handle it? I'm old, sweetheart, not helpless." A heavy silence filled the line. "Mom would want you to be safe," Sarah said finally. "Your mother would understand exactly why I'm staying," Frank replied, watching Bear pause his patrol to check on him. "This isn't just about the farm anymore. It's about not giving up what matters just because it gets hard." After hanging up, Frank pulled out Martha's old photo album. There was a picture of the day they'd brought Bear home, a clumsy white puppy who'd grown into the most loyal partner he could have asked for. A sharp howl cut through the night, closer than ever before. Bear's answering growl was immediate, his massive form a white sentinel in the darkness. Frank moved to the window beside his dog, laying a weathered hand on Bear's broad back. "They're testing us, aren't they, boy?" The next morning brought fresh tracks in the snow, wolf prints circling the entire perimeter of the farm. But what troubled Frank most was finding tufts of gray fur caught in the new fence wire. The wolves hadn't just been testing, they'd been actively probing for weaknesses. David arrived around noon, his truck loaded with additional solar lights and motion sensors. "Technology's not much against wolves," he admitted, helping Frank install the equipment. "But every little bit helps." As they worked, Bear kept the sheep tightly grouped, constantly moving between them and the tree line. The dog hadn't slept properly in days, but his dedication never wavered. "Frank," David said as they finished, "there's something else. The Petersons lost their entire flock last night, 10 miles north. These wolves, they're hunting in patterns we've never seen before. Coordinated, strategic." Frank watched Bear guide the sheep toward the barn for the night, the dog's movements precise despite his exhaustion. "They may be smart," he said finally, "but they don't understand loyalty." That night, as the temperature dropped below zero and the wind howled through the valley, Frank made up his mind. He wouldn't run, wouldn't abandon the land that held every memory of his life with Martha. But more than that, he wouldn't betray the trust of the dog who had given him everything. Bear settled by Frank's bed, his usual spot, but his ears remained pricked, listening. Both man and dog knew that soon, very soon, the wolves would make their move. And when they did, everything would depend on the unshakable bond between an old farmer and his faithful guardian. The attack came 3 nights later, during the worst blizzard of the season. Frank woke to Bear's deep, threatening bark, not his usual alert, but a sound of imminent danger. The bedside clock read 2:17 a.m. "Bear!" Frank fumbled for his glasses and boots, his heart pounding. The dog was already at the back door, his entire body rigid with tension. The howling wind masked other sounds, But when Frank flicked on the outdoor lights, he saw them, dark shapes moving through the swirling snow, heading toward the barn where the sheep were housed. The motion sensors David had installed began triggering one after another, creating a trail of illumination that revealed at least 5 wolves, larger than any Frank had seen in his life. Bear's muscles bunched under Frank's hand. "Stay close," Frank ordered, grabbing his rifle and flashlight. The dog understood, keeping pace with his master as they stepped into the bitter cold. The wind cut through Frank's heavy coat like knives, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the barn, where frightened bleating rose above the storm. The wolves had found a way in through the back. They'd actually dug under the foundation where the snow had drifted highest. "Dear God," Frank breathed, seeing the size of the lead wolf as it emerged from the barn, dragging one of his ewes. The animal was enormous, its shoulders nearly 4 feet high. Bear didn't wait for a command. He launched forward with explosive power, covering the 30 yards to the barn in seconds. The lead wolf dropped its prey and turned to meet the challenge, lips pulled back from gleaming teeth. Frank raised his rifle, but the swirling snow and moving bodies made it impossible to get a clear shot. He could only watch as Bear collided with the wolf in a fury of snarls and snapping teeth. The other wolves emerged from the barn, circling the fighting pair. Frank recognized their strategy. They were trying to separate Bear from him to divide their opposition. He fired a warning shot into the air, causing several wolves to leap back, but the storm swallowed the sound almost immediately. Bear was holding his own against the lead wolf, his protective breeding and greater weight giving him an advantage, but Frank could see blood staining the snow beneath them. Whether it was Bear's or the wolf's, he couldn't tell. Then Frank saw something that made his blood run cold. 2 more wolves slinking around the far side of the barn. This wasn't just an attack. It was a coordinated assault. While Bear was occupied with the leaders, the others were going for the sheep. "Bear! The barn!" Frank shouted above the wind, starting forward. His foot hit a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. At 73, even a small fall could be devastating, and Frank felt himself going down hard. His rifle flew from his grip, disappearing into a snowdrift. Bear heard his master's cry of pain. In that split second of distraction, the lead wolf lunged, its teeth finding purchase in Bear's shoulder. But instead of yielding, Bear seemed to draw strength from Frank's predicament. With a tremendous surge, he threw off his attacker and bounded toward his fallen master. The wolves, sensing advantage, began to close in. Frank managed to sit up, his hip screaming in pain, as Bear took up a defensive position over him. The dog's white coat was stained with blood, but his growl was unwavering as he faced down the entire pack. It was a tableau frozen in the swirling snow, one dog protecting his master against overwhelming odds, buying precious time. But even as Frank struggled to stand, he knew they were in serious trouble. The wolves were too many, too strong, and the storm was getting worse. Then, through the howling wind, came a sound that made both man and dog turn their heads. Truck engines, growing louder. Headlights cut through the blizzard from multiple directions, and gunshots cracked the night air. "Frank, hold on." David Anderson's voice carried through the storm, followed by more shouts and the sound of running feet. The wolves, confronted with multiple threats, began to retreat. The lead wolf locked eyes with Bear one final time, a gaze that promised this wasn't over, before leading its pack into the darkness. As neighbors converged on the farm, Frank reached up to touch Bear's face, his hands shaking. The dog was bleeding from several wounds, but his eyes never left the tree line where the wolves had disappeared. "Good boy," Frank whispered, his voice breaking. "My brave good boy." But as David and others helped Frank to his feet and began assessing the damage, everyone knew this was just the beginning. The wolves would be back, and next time they would be even more determined. Bear pressed against Frank's leg, supporting his master's weight despite his own injuries. They had survived the first real battle, but the war for survival was far from over. The local veterinarian, Dr. Amy Chun, worked methodically in Frank's kitchen-turned-medical station, cleaning Bear's wounds by lamplight. The blizzard had knocked out power to half the county, but the emergency generator hummed steadily outside, keeping the essential lights on. 12 stitches in the shoulder, Dr. Chun reported, her gentle hands working despite Bear's size. 3 more on his neck and various smaller cuts. He's lucky another inch to the left, and that wolf would have hit his jugular. Frank sat nearby, an ice pack on his bruised hip, watching every movement. Bear hadn't made a sound during the treatment, his eyes fixed on his master as if to say, "I'm fine, don't worry." David Anderson and several other neighbors had stayed to help secure the farm. They'd found 2 dead sheep and treated 3 injured ones, but thanks to Bear's intervention, most of the flock had survived. "The game warden's on his way," David said, coming in from another property check. "Should be here by morning, once the roads are cleared." But Frank... He hesitated, looking at the elderly farmer. This pack, there's something else. The way they coordinated that attack. Dr. Chun nodded as she applied the final bandage to Bear's shoulder. "I've treated wolf attacks before, but these wounds..." She gestured to Bear's injuries. "The bite force was exceptional. These aren't ordinary wolves." Frank absorbed this information silently, remembering the size of the pack leader. "How long before he heals?" he asked, nodding toward Bear. 2 weeks minimum before those stitches come out." Dr. Chun replied firmly. "He needs rest, Frank. No patrolling, no confrontations." Bear whined softly at this, rising despite his injuries to check the window. His duty to protect ran bone deep. "We'll help watch the farm," David assured them. "Tom Wheeler and his boys are setting up a rotation. Nobody's leaving you alone out here." Frank's phone buzzed, his daughter Sarah again. He'd have to tell her about tonight, knowing it would only increase her worry. But as he reached for the phone, Bear suddenly stiffened, his ears forward. Everyone fell silent, listening. Through the dying storm came a long, haunting howl, different from normal wolf calls. It sounded almost like a challenge. "They're still out there," David said quietly. "Watching." Dr. Chun finished packing her medical kit. "Frank, maybe you should consider Dash." "I'm not leaving." Frank cut her off, more sharply than he intended. He softened his tone. "This farm, these animals, they're my responsibility. Bear understands that. Don't you, boy?" The dog pressed against Frank's leg in response, careful of his own injuries but steadfast in his support. As the night wore on and neighbors departed, promising to return at dawn, Frank settled into his armchair near the fireplace. Bear lay at his feet, breaking his window vigil only because the pain medication was finally taking effect. "You saved my life tonight," Frank said softly, reaching down to stroke Bear's head. "Saved everything." Bear's tail thumped once against the floor, but his eyes were already growing heavy. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to truly rest, knowing others were watching over the farm. Frank pulled out Martha's old journal, turning to an entry she'd written shortly after they'd gotten Bear as a puppy. "There's something special about this one. The way he looks at Frank. It's like he knows his purpose in this world is to be there for him." Outside, the storm finally began to ease, revealing a landscape transformed by snow and darkness. The wolves had withdrawn for now, but they'd left their message clear. This was only the beginning. Frank watched the moonlight create shadows on the snow, his mind working. They needed a better strategy, a way to protect the farm that didn't rely solely on Bear's courage. Because next time, and there would be a next time, the wolves would be ready for him. Bear shifted in his sleep, whimpering slightly as his wounds pained him. Frank laid a gentle hand on his dog's side, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath the bandages. "Rest now, old friend," he whispered. "We'll figure this out together." The next few days brought changes to Willow Creek Farm. Frank's property became a hub of community activity as neighbors worked together to fortify defenses against the wolf pack. The game warden's report had only confirmed their fears. This was a unique pack from Canada, driven south by harsh conditions and changing territories. "They're highly adaptive," Warden Mike Torres explained, spreading a map across Frank's kitchen table. Bear lay nearby, his bandaged shoulder healing but his attention never wavering from the discussions. We've tracked their movement south. Every farm they've hit, they've learned from. Traditional deterrents aren't working. Frank studied the marked locations on the map, noting the pattern. They're moving with purpose, he observed. Not just random attacks. Exactly. Torres pointed to various spots. They probe defenses first, then wait, then hit hard. But your place? He paused, looking at Bear. This is the first time they've met real resistance. You've got something special here, Frank. That dog of yours changed their pattern. The community response had been overwhelming. Tom Wheeler and his sons installed additional security lights and cameras. The Anderson family helped reinforce the barn with metal plating at ground level. Even old Mrs. Patterson from the general store sent over supplies and her famous beef stew. Sarah called daily, her worry evident. Dad, the local paper up here ran a story about the wolves. They're saying these animals are different. Maybe even some kind of hybrid. Honey, we're handling it, Frank assured her, watching through the window as David's teenage sons strung another set of lights. The whole community's come together. That's exactly what worries me, Sarah countered. If it takes an entire community to fight them. Frank understood her concern, but his resolve hadn't wavered. If anything, Bear's courage had strengthened it. The dog was already fighting his restricted activity, trying to resume his duties despite Dr. Chen's orders. One afternoon, as Frank checked Bear's healing wounds, he heard an unexpected vehicle coming up the drive. It was Robert Running Bear, an elder from the nearby reservation who occasionally traded at local farms. Been hearing about your troubles, the elder said, declining to come inside. His dark eyes studied Bear with interest. Reminds me of stories my grandfather told, about when the big wolves would come down from the north during hard winters. Frank invited him to sit on the porch, where Robert shared traditional knowledge about wolf behavior and ancient methods of protection. Your dog, he said, nodding to Bear. He has what our people call warrior spirit, but even warriors need medicine. From his truck, Robert brought out several items: special herbs to mask scent, traditional remedies for wound healing, and most surprisingly, a hand-carved wolf tooth on a leather cord. For your guardian, he said, offering it to Frank. Our old ones say it helps a protector find strength when needed most. Frank was touched by the gesture, carefully securing the token to Bear's collar. The dog sat perfectly still for this, as if understanding the significance. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Frank sat on his porch watching Bear test his healing shoulder with careful movements. The community's vehicles had left for the day, leaving behind their improvements but taking the comforting sounds of human activity. The silence that followed felt heavy with anticipation. In the distance, a wolf howled, the distinct call of the pack leader. Bear's ears pricked forward, but he remained calm, the carved tooth gleaming at his throat. They're waiting, Frank said quietly, more to himself than to Bear. Learning our new defenses, planning their next move. Bear pressed against his leg, offering silent support. Despite his injuries, the dog's presence remained as strong and reassuring as ever. Frank reached down to scratch behind his ears, feeling the bandages that would come off soon. The security lights clicked on automatically as darkness fell, creating a protective circle of illumination around the farm. Cameras hummed, sensors stood ready, and reinforced barriers guarded the animals. They had done everything possible to prepare. But as Frank looked out into the gathering darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that all these modern defenses might not be enough. The real test would come down to the ancient things: courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. Bear seemed to sense his thoughts, rising to stand at attention, his warrior's spirit undiminished by his wounds. Together, they watched the night deepen, knowing that somewhere out there, other eyes were watching too, waiting for their moment to strike again. 2 weeks passed with an eerie quiet settling over Willow Creek Farm. Dr. Chun removed Bear's stitches, pleased with his healing but concerned about his restlessness. The massive dog had grown increasingly alert, sleeping only in short bursts, his behavior suggesting he sensed something the humans couldn't yet perceive. The calm before the storm, David Anderson commented one morning, helping Frank check the perimeter. No wolf signs for days, but they're still here, Frank finished, watching Bear investigate a cluster of trees. The dog's movements were fluid again, his injuries healed, though new scars marked his white coat. Bear knows it. That afternoon, Frank received an unexpected call from his son Michael in Chicago. "Dad, I've been thinking, maybe I could take some time off. Come help out for a while." Frank smiled at the offer, remembering how Michael had always been the protective one. "Son, you've got your own family to worry about. We're managing here. It's just..." Michael hesitated. "Sarah showed me the videos from the security cameras. Those wolves, Dad, they're not normal. And after what happened to Mom..." The unfinished sentence hung heavy in the air. Martha's heart attack had come so suddenly, with none of their children able to reach the farm in time. Frank knew their guilt still lingered. "This is different," Frank assured him. "I'm not alone this time. I've got Bear and the whole community." As if hearing his name, Bear appeared at Frank's side, pressing his large head against Frank's hip. The carved wolf tooth from Robert Running Bear glinted at his collar, becoming a constant reminder of the strength they drew from each other. Later that evening, Frank sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered fields in shades of gold and purple. Bear lay at his feet, but his relaxed posture was deceptive. His eyes constantly scanned the tree line, his ears moving to track every sound. The relative peace was interrupted by the arrival of Warden Torres's truck. The game warden's expression was grave as he approached the porch. "Frank, we've got trouble," Torres said without preamble. "Just got reports from across the Canadian border. Remember those missing sheep from the Peterson place? We found them, what's left of them, 15 miles north. The wolves didn't eat them all. They're storing food." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Storing? It's calculated behavior. They're preparing for something big. Torres ran a hand through his hair. "And there's more. We found tracks, lots of them. The pack's grown. We think they've merged with another group." Bear rose slowly, moving to stand between Frank and the darkening tree line. The dog's posture spoke of readiness, of understanding more than humans might credit him for. "How many?" Frank asked quietly. "Based on the tracks? At least 12, maybe more. And that lead wolf, the big one that fought Bear? He's definitely in charge of the combined pack." Frank absorbed this information, watching the last light fade from the sky. The security lights began clicking on one by one, creating their protective circle, but somehow the illumination felt inadequate against the growing darkness. "I've called in additional resources," Torres continued. "But with this weather system moving in..." He gestured to the heavy clouds gathering above the mountains. "Help might not arrive in time." Bear suddenly stiffened, his attention fixed on something in the distance. Both men fell silent, listening. At first, there was nothing but the wind, then a howl. Another answered, then another. The sounds came from different directions, forming a chorus that spoke of numbers and strength. "They're coordinating," Torres said softly, "surrounding the area." Frank laid a hand on Bear's back, feeling the tension in the dog's muscles. The carved tooth seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, a reminder of Robert Running Bear's words about warrior spirits and ancient strengths. "When?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. "The storm's hitting tomorrow night. Heavy snow, high winds, perfect cover for them." Torres checked his rifle automatically. "I'll have every available officer in the area, but in those conditions..." Bear turned to look at Frank, his brown eyes carrying a depth of understanding that transcended the barrier between man and dog. In that gaze was a promise, the same one he'd made every day since Martha's passing. "You are not alone." "We'll be ready," Frank said, as much to Bear as to Torres. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As darkness claimed the land and the wolves' chorus faded into silence, Frank and Bear remained on the porch, sentinels against the gathering night. Tomorrow would bring the storm, and with it, a battle that would test the limits of courage, loyalty, and the bond between a man and his guardian. The storm arrived as predicted, turning the world white by mid-afternoon. Frank spent the morning making final preparations, acutely aware of Bear's growing tension. The dog hadn't left his side all day, breaking his vigilance only to check on the sheep now secured in the reinforced barn. "Power's starting to go out across the county," David reported by phone. "Roads are nearly impassable. Frank will try to get there, but..." "Stay home," Frank insisted. "Keep your family safe. We've got the generator, the security systems, and Bear." As if acknowledging his name, Bear moved to the window, his posture alert. The carved tooth at his collar caught the fading light, seeming to glow against his white fur. Warden Torres and 2 other officers had managed to reach the farm before the worst of the storm hit. They now patrolled the perimeter, their dark uniforms nearly invisible in the growing gloom. "Movement in the trees," Torres called over the radio. "Multiple signatures. They're using the storm for cover, just like we expected." Frank checked his rifle one last time, then pulled on his heavy coat. Bear was already at the door, his breath fogging the glass, muscles coiled with controlled energy. "Together, boy," Frank said softly, "just like always." The wind hit them like a physical force as they stepped outside. Snow whirled in thick curtains, reducing visibility to mere yards. The security lights created islands of illumination in the white darkness, but the spaces between seemed darker than ever. A howl cut through the storm, closer than expected. Bear's answering growl was deep, determined. He positioned himself slightly ahead of Frank, their years of partnership evident in every synchronized movement. "Contact, north side," one of the officers shouted through the radio. Gunshots followed, nearly lost in the wind. Then Frank saw them, shadows moving through the snow, more than he could count. The wolves had indeed grown in number, and they moved with frightening coordination, testing the perimeter from multiple points. Bear spotted the pack leader before Frank did, the massive gray wolf emerging from the storm like a ghost. It was even larger than Frank remembered, its amber eyes fixing on Bear with cold intelligence. What followed was chaos. The wolves attacked in waves, some engaging the officers while others probed the farm's defenses. Bear met the pack leader head-on, their collision a brutal dance of teeth and power. Frank fired carefully, conscious of the swirling snow and moving bodies, but for every wolf that fell back, 2 more seemed to emerge from the storm. "They're heading for the barn," Torres shouted. "They're using the fight as a diversion." Frank turned to see shadows slipping past the security lights, heading for where the sheep were housed. But before he could move, he heard a sharp yelp of pain. Bear had taken a hit, blood staining the snow beneath him. The pack leader pressed its advantage, driving Bear back, trying to separate him from Frank. Other wolves began closing in, their strategy becoming clear: divide the defenders, then overwhelm them. In that moment, Frank made a decision that would have made Martha proud and Sarah furious. He turned away from the barn, away from the sheep, and moved to support his dog. "I'm here, Bear," he called through the storm. "We fight together." Bear's response was immediate and powerful. Finding new strength in his master's presence, he surged forward, catching the pack leader off guard. The carved tooth gleamed as he moved, and for a moment, Frank could have sworn it pulsed with its own light. The battle around them intensified. Gunshots echoed, wolves snarled, and the storm raged on. But in the midst of it all, something extraordinary was happening. Bear and Frank moved as one, watching each other's backs, protecting each other with a synchronization born of years of trust and love. The pack leader, sensing the shift in momentum, changed tactics. It lunged not at Bear, but at Frank, hoping to eliminate the weaker target. But Bear was ready. He intercepted the attack with explosive force, and this time, when teeth met flesh, it was the wolf that yelped in pain. "Frank!" Torres's voice carried through the storm. More incoming from the east. But as Frank turned to face this new threat, a different sound cut through the chaos. Truck engines, many of them, and getting closer. Headlights pierced the swirling snow, accompanied by voices Frank recognized. Despite the impassable roads, despite the danger, the community had come. David Anderson's truck led the charge, followed by Tom Wheeler's sons in their four-wheel drives. Robert Running Bear's vehicle appeared from another direction, the elder himself standing in the truck bed, raising what looked like an ancient rifle. The wolves, caught between multiple threats and now outnumbered themselves, began to retreat. The pack leader, bleeding from its encounter with Bear, locked eyes with the dog one final time. In that gaze was something like respect before it turned and vanished into the storm, its pack following. Bear stood his ground until the last wolf disappeared, then finally allowed himself to check on Frank. The dog was bleeding from several new wounds, but his eyes were clear and strong. "Good boy," Frank whispered, dropping to his knees in the snow to embrace his guardian. "My brave good boy." As neighbors and officers converged on them, checking for injuries and securing the area, Frank held onto Bear, feeling the dog's steady heartbeat against his chest. They had faced the storm together, and together they had survived. But something told Frank this victory, while significant, wasn't the end of their story. The wolves had retreated, but the pack leader's final look suggested unfinished business. The storm raged on, but for now, at least, Willow Creek Farm was safe, protected by the unshakable bond between an old farmer and his faithful guardian. The days following the battle brought both relief and reflection to Willow Creek Farm. The community's response had proven decisive, but the price of victory was evident in the aftermath. 2 sheep had been lost, fencing needed repairs, and Bear's new injuries, though less severe than before, still required Dr. Chen's attention. "You're lucky," she said, cleaning a gash on Bear's flank while Frank watched from his kitchen chair. "Both of you, those wolves could have killed you." Bear endured the treatment stoically, his eyes never leaving Frank. The carved tooth at his collar had somehow survived the fight unmarked, still gleaming with that peculiar energy. "Robert Running Bear wants to see you both," Dr. Chen added, applying the last bandage. "Says it's important." The elder arrived that afternoon, studying the battlefield with knowing eyes. Tracks in the trampled snow told the story of the previous night's combat, and workers were still repairing damaged fencing. "Your guardian has proven himself worthy of the ancient medicine," Robert said, gesturing to the tooth at Bear's collar. "But the battle is not over." Frank nodded, having sensed the same thing. "They'll be back? Perhaps, but not as enemies." Robert's weathered face creased in a slight smile. The pack leader recognized something last night, something that may change everything. As if to confirm his words, a lone howl echoed from the distant trees. Bear's ears pricked forward, but his posture remained relaxed, curious rather than defensive. Over the next few weeks, a strange transformation occurred. The wolves began appearing singly or in pairs, not to attack, but to patrol the borders of Frank's property. They kept their distance from the farm itself, but their presence discouraged other predators. "It's like they're helping to guard the place," David observed one morning, watching a large wolf track along the tree line. "Never seen anything like it." Bear seemed to understand before any of the humans. He would acknowledge the wolf's presence with dignified attention, and occasionally the pack leader itself would appear. The massive gray wolf would meet Bear's gaze across the distance, 2 guardians recognizing each other's territory and strength. Sarah flew in for a visit, bringing her children. Initially fearful of the stories she'd heard, she watched in amazement as her kids played safely in the yard under the watchful eyes of both Bear and the distant wolves. "It's like something out of a legend," she said to Frank. "How did this happen?" Frank thought about Robert Running Bear's words about warrior spirits and ancient medicines. He thought about the night of the battle, about choices made in moments of crisis, about loyalty that transcended species. "Sometimes," he said, watching Bear guide his grandchildren away from a slippery patch of ice, "respect is earned in ways we don't expect." The winter slowly released its grip on Willow Creek Farm. The security lights remained, the cameras still watched, but they seemed less crucial now. The community's bonds, strengthened by shared crisis, manifested in regular visits and continued support. One crisp morning, Frank sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered fields. Bear lay at his feet, gray starting to show around his muzzle, but his spirit as strong as ever. The carved tooth caught the early light, a reminder of the night that had changed everything. A movement at the tree line drew their attention. The pack leader stood there, its own battle scars visible in its coat. Behind it, several wolves emerged, including, Frank noticed with surprise, young pups. Bear rose slowly, maintaining eye contact with his former adversary. The pack leader dipped its head once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Then it turned, gathering its family, and disappeared into the forest. "Well, old friend," Frank said softly to Bear. "Looks like we've found a different way to protect the farm." Bear pressed against his leg in response, his solid presence as reassuring as ever. They had faced death together, fought side by side, and in doing so had transformed enemies into allies. Martha's journal lay open on Frank's lap, turned to one of her last entries. "Love, in all its forms, has the power to change hearts, even those we think beyond reaching." Frank added his own words below hers. "And sometimes, the greatest guardian is not the one who fights the hardest, but the one who shows us a better way." Bear's tail thumped against the porch boards in agreement. Around them, Willow Creek Farm awakened to another day, protected now not just by fences and lights, but by an understanding that transcended the traditional boundaries between wild and tame, between adversaries and allies. As the sun climbed higher, Frank scratched behind Bear's ears, feeling profound gratitude for this faithful companion who had not only saved his life, but had also shown him that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into friends.